Coming from the US, originally from Germany, she's a senior software engineer at Netflix, known for her expertise in UI development, from Objective-C to modern tech. Her experience includes contributions to VLC, Apple, and roles in startups to Silicon Valley giants, all fueled by her passion for creating excellent product experiences. Let's welcome Carola Nitz.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to talk about adopting GraphQL today. But before I dive in, I would like to see a little bit hands who's working currently with GraphQL. Okay, great. Who's only heard of GraphQL but doesn't really know exactly what it is? So I was in that group half a year ago. Who has no idea what I'm talking about? Great, amazing. And who didn't realize this was participatory and didn't raise their hand? All right. Okay, now that I have your attention, my name is Carola Nitz. I'm a senior software engineer at Netflix. I've been doing iOS now for about, well, over a decade. But I want to say I've only done GraphQL now since the summer, so I wouldn't consider myself an expert, but I figured all the things that I've learned are worth sharing, so that's why I'm here today. So the contents of my talk. First, I'm going to go over the problem that GraphQL tries to solve. Then I'm going to look a little bit at the components of GraphQL, the schema, and the operations. Then we're going to go over some tools that make it easier for you to work with GraphQL, Graphical, and Apollo. And not last yet, but learnings for cleaner code and performance. And then, last but not least, who should use GraphQL? So, an example of the world without GraphQL, REST and custom API endpoints. You might have seen this already. You're doing a normal URL request. You're asking for data. You get JSON back. You have a JSON decoder. And now you're decoding it into a struct that you have written yourself, user data here. And you can use it. Simple, right? But in practice, it's a little bit more complicated. You might have a very difficult application screen where you get, for example, here the title and the synopsis, the description of the title from a title service, and if you can play it. Then you might go over to a talent service and you ask, okay, like, what's the cast? What's the creator? But you're not only getting that back, you're also getting the director, you're getting the writers. And maybe afterwards, for the related IDs of that title, you're going to an image service, and now you're asking for the images and artworks there. And if you haven't realized, this is so slow. I need to do so much work, right? So why do I need to do a lot of work? Well, I'm spending a lot of time now orchestrating all of my calls. I'm then mapping all of the data from all of the data that I'm getting back to the one that I actually need to use. I might have high latency because I'm fetching more data than I actually need, and I'm making more round trips than I need to do. So what if, instead of making all of these 3 calls, I'm having just one URL and send only the data I needed? So there are actually a couple of solutions that came out. GraphQL is the one that we're going to talk about, but Netflix also built their own, and I'm not going to dive too deep into this, but we also open sourced a JavaScript library that solved the same problem, and it was developed around the same time, but GraphQL is the one that took off. So what is GraphQL? GraphQL is an open source data query language and runtime for APIs. It was developed by Facebook. I think they started in 2012, but it was initially released in 2015. And in 2018, it actually moved to the GraphQL Foundation that is now hosted by Linux. And since then, over 2,000 companies have adopted it. So you can see Facebook, obviously, but also Shopify, GitHub is one of them. And a couple more. You can expand that view and you will see. And obviously, Netflix is now also using it. So I wanted to touch a little bit of the benefits of GraphQL, or basically any industry standard that you're using. So if so many companies are using it, usually you get quality out of the box. There's a reason why they use it. And they build tools around it, right? So you can tap into the ecosystem if you're using that. You can leverage the active community that is contributing to GraphQL. So for us, for example, having our own implementation, Falcor, we always had our internal team working on it to push it forward. And another benefit is new hires are likely familiar with GraphQL. For us, it was like, okay, if somebody came to the company, we had to actually train them on Falcor. So there were a couple of benefits for us to move over to GraphQL. So now let's dive into the components, the fun stuff, right? So the first most important thing for GraphQL is its schema. It's the source of truth and the representation of everything that you can ask for. It is written in a schema definition language, and usually you get it from your backend team, or it might be available online. So for example, GitHub has its schema online and you can use it and try it out, or SpaceX is also used quite a lot. And it is made out of types with fields. So this is, for example, one from the Netflix schema. And you will see in the fields down there a couple of things that you know already, like string and Boolean and ints. And there's a video which is actually referencing another type video. And you can think of it as an object that has basically a reference to another object that is building your graph. So that's basically where that comes from. And a little bit about the types. So they're strongly typed, and they have clear nullability. Strongly typed means you don't have something that is just an any object and you don't know what it is. But there's a difference between Swift and GraphQL, which really tripped me up when I first looked at it. Is it optional? Well, in Swift we just say it's a string, but in GraphQL type you have to do the exclamation mark. This is not optional. In Swift, we're used to okay, it might be a string, it might not. But in GraphQL world, it's the same thing as we know from Swift as the not optional. So if you look at that, that's something to keep in mind. Okay, now the operations and tools. There are 3 types of operations that you can use, and they're also defined in the schema. The one is the query. It's basically like the get, where you can ask for data. There are mutations, where you can basically change the data on the server. And then there are subscriptions. So you basically say hey, let me know if you change something on your server. And one great tool that you get out of the box with GraphQL is Graphical. This is how it looks like. It's the integrated developer environment, and you can try out your queries. So in the middle, you can see that I've written a query called videos. And I'm asking for a video that you might know, it's Stranger Things. And I'm defining the title and a promo video on there and a short synopsis. And when I hit the play button, I can immediately see the JSON that I get back. And you will notice that it immediately maps to the data that I'm asking for, the title, the promo video, the short synopsis. If I would add another one in there, it would just show up just the same way. So it's super nice, you can immediately see it. On the left side, because we have a schema with all of the types, we can actually see our APIs, and we can go through it, and we can actually select different fields in there that could also show up then in the query in the middle. We get validation, it gives us auto-completion, it gives us so many things that just speed up development quite a bit. And you can even trace in there your calls and see how fast they're actually executed or how slow. So with that, ludicrous speed already. I don't need to map data, I only do one call, it's great. But you're asking me, how can I use this? Glad you're asking. So Apollo Client is something that you probably will not get past if you look for GraphQL and iOS. You could use it without it, but it's a really great Swift-first GraphQL client, and it gives you a lot out of the box. So one of the most things that I like a lot is the code generation that it gives you, but it also gives you a normalized cache, and it also gives you the networking layer and the GraphQL execution layer. So it's relatively simple. You just add Apollo via SPM. Once you did that, you can select on your project the install command line tool. And then you initialize via the command line you initialize it and you say the schema and tell it like, please output a package manager. This is how this looks then. And then you put in the query that you've seen before, for example, into your project folder with the schema. Again, the schema you either get from your backend team or you can download it online. And all you got to do then is just run the command line tool with generate. And you have your Swift package that you can add then locally. And you can see it here on the left, it's added. And then you have your query in there that you can now use in your application. And it also generated you the data that you're actually going to use later on. So in your code, this would look like this. By the way, this is very simplified, so please don't copy and paste it like that. What you want to do is you want to have a shared instance instead for the Apollo client. And don't just print your error like I do in here. You probably want to handle that gracefully. But you can immediately see how I can use the fields that I declared in my query right here in the code. So if I want to add another field right now, all that I got to do is like I add it to my query, I run the code generation, and I can use it immediately here in the code. For me personally, this is so, so fast. Learnings, okay. Now the nerdy stuff for those who are already working with GraphQL. First thing is cleaner code. So you can use something that is called fragments. It is for code snippets that can be shared between queries and mutations. And you can see it here at the bottom, the ... content advisory, which is then just being unfurled into whatever you define in your fragment. This breaks up big generated files into a query one and a fragment one. And you can use that fragment type then in your Swift function. So next up is extensions. If you want to handle nullability or default values, extensions are your friend. You can just use them on the generated type. We also use it for often used logic. So in this example here, position is something that we use quite often, where you left off like a movie or a show. And depending on if it is a show or a movie here, it will return the position. Performance. Everybody always loves more performant code. So one thing that GraphQL tries to solve is the overfetching, but you can still do a little bit more. You want to look, for example, at your app and think about what kind of data do I actually need immediately. So you don't need to fetch everything at once. For example, it's probably very, very hard to read, but next to the cast, there's a small more button, which would unfurl and gives you the writers and gives you the maturity rating, and that could be in another query. But you also probably don't want to do that too much. If you know that some people are using an action constantly, you probably want to fetch that immediately to avoid long waiting times for users. Querying the correct size. You can use input parameters. In this case, I use the width and the height so that you can ask for the right artwork parameters. In general, obviously, we always want to not have like big images on small phones or small images on big iPads, so you can use parameters as well. If you have something more difficult, you can define something called an input type. In our case, for example, we have something called artwork parameters where we define the format of it. In this case, it's a JPEG. Something else that you can do is you can only query the data that you need. So there is something called the add skip and include directive, which lets you include or skip certain fields depending on a parameter. This is very, very handy if you're running your code, obviously, on iPhone and iPad, but I've also learned that some companies are sharing their queries cross-platform. So they might have someone write it like on iOS and then somebody on Android is using it and just generating that code. If you have multiple fields that you want to include or exclude, there's something called an inline fragment, and you can see that in the example here at the bottom. So on the video that I'm getting back, I'm saying, on the video, include this only if I'm on tablet, and only then will I have the title and the artwork. Now something even more nerdy, automatically persisted queries. So when you're sending queries over, you're sending that entire string over, usually. But automatically persisted queries will reduce the requested latency by only sending a hash of that query. So for example, I ported over the display page into GraphQL, and that was like 3,000 characters. If you hash that, that's like 64. So what it does, it's basically sending to the server just the hash. And if the server doesn't know it yet, it's just gonna send you an error back, and then the client will just send it back over with the full query string and the hash. And from then on, the server knows. So whenever another client now goes over and like sends over the hash, the server will just answer. So that can reduce a lot of the latency. But something that you shouldn't mistake it with is something called persisted queries. Persisted queries is a feature that requires operations to be registered in a persisted query language. So that is basically a safe list. As I mentioned, you can change your queries and the types in there. Sometimes you want to make sure that you just like execute queries that you've written yourself instead of like having a bad actor that is trying to get data. So that is a way how you can do this. And as I mentioned, it's not a performance tool, but it's actually a security feature. If you want to enable that, you have to adjust the code generation file. That was the one that was seen when you installed the command line tool at the top. I didn't actually point it out, but that is what you need to add there. You need to say that it needs an operation ID, and then you need to publish an operation manifest. And that needs to happen every time you do an app release. And you might get a feel now for, okay, there's actually a lot more that I need to do when I want to use GraphQL. So who should use it? I think GraphQL is a really, really good solution if you have very, very complex data requirements, if you're fetching from different services, and if you have nested or related data. It is also helpful if you have very client needs, like web, mobile, TV, and they can then only request the data that you need, or if you have it available to other people. Or if you're doing a lot of agile development or prototyping, that way you don't constantly need to adjust your servers if you change something. On the other side, I think REST is a really great choice for predictable data. If that doesn't change a lot, like, I don't think you need GraphQL. Also, there's a lot of overhead still required. Like, you need to set up the schema, you need to have resolvers that will actually like resolve the query down to the server services that you're using underneath. So that might not be justified for everybody. And other things that you should know is like if you rely heavily on web caching or need versioning or like HTTP errors, GraphQL requests always send you a 200 back, and the error is just in the response that you have in there. And the schema is not versioned. You just deprecate fields and then hope that the clients are not using it anymore, and when the usage goes down, you just remove it. So, looking back, GraphQL is not a silver bullet. You should know what your company needs. But if you think it is good, it can really speed up development. We learned a little bit about tools like GraphQL and Apollo that make it easier to work with GraphQL. And we learned how we can adjust queries to have cleaner, more performant code. And we also saw when it makes sense to use GraphQL or when it also doesn't make sense. And if you want to learn a little bit more, there was an amazing talk by Vincenzo Pascarella. He talks about how you can use GraphQL, install Apollo, how you can add your credentials, how you can use it in your SwiftUI app. If you want to learn a little bit more how Netflix is scaling its API with GraphQL Federation, there are a couple of articles as well. If you like conferences, there's an entire conference for GraphQL. And the Apollo iOS docs are also super, super helpful. Thank you. By the way, I'm gonna do questions after the talks because I prefer to do that. Thank you.